During the Republican convention, a prominent aide to Mitt Romney said that the Romney presidency would be modeled after the administration of our 11th president, James K. Polk. To many Americans, this seems like an odd correlation to draw. In 2008, Obama drew parallels to his adopted state's most noble son, Abraham Lincoln. But you don't see land of Polk signs anywhere in Tennessee. Why would a Romney campaign draw a comparison to an almost forgotten president? Who was James Knox Polk, and why is he significant today? James Knox Polk was born on November 2, 1795, in a log cabin near Pineville, North Carolina. He would become the second of three presidents born in North Carolina, and just like Jackson and Johnson, he would eventually move to Tennessee. When he was just 10 years old, his family would move to the Tennessee frontier, but James himself would return in order to get an education. At age 23, he would graduate from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with academic honors. His alma mater would eventually erect a quadrangle and a statue in his honor. He is, after all, the most famous Tar Heel, who never learned to dunk. Polk soon returned to Tennessee. After a short time practicing law, he was elected to the Tennessee state legislature. A year later, in 1824, he was married to Miss Sarah Childress, the daughter of a wealthy land speculator. Sarah was one of the most educated young women in the state, and the couple had known each other since primary school. Soon, Polk himself would catch the eye of one of the most prominent Americans of the era, a fellow North Carolina-born Tennessean, Andrew Jackson. Polk's home in Columbia became the meeting place for the state's political elite. His friendship and loyalty to Jackson would rocket him to the national political scene. Polk was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and during Jackson's presidency would serve as his friend and mentor's greatest ally in Congress, earning the nickname Young Hickory. In 1835, Polk became the highly popular Democratic Party's Speaker of the House. In 1837, Jackson's second term came to a close, and he was succeeded by his vice president, Martin Van Buren. The nation experienced a great financial collapse, and Polk returned to Tennessee after a victory in his state's gubernatorial election. At the time, the governor of Tennessee only served 2-year terms. Polk would lose bids for re-election in both 1841 and 1843. Polk was a dark horse candidate in the 1844 presidential election. President Van Buren, who had lost his re-election campaign in 1841, was the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party. There was one issue that looked like it could decide the election: the Texas question. Both Van Buren and the Whig Party nominee, Henry Clay, declared themselves opposed to the annexation of Texas. Polk believed that Texas should be annexed and that the Oregon Territory, then disputed with Britain, should be occupied by American forces. Andrew Jackson, mentor to both Polk and Van Buren and the undisputed head of the Democratic Party, decided to support Polk as the candidate who was committed to the ideal of manifest destiny. At the Democratic Convention, Polk was nominated on the 9th ballot. George Dallas, a former mayor of Philadelphia, Van Buren's ambassador to Russia and a leader of the prominent family party faction within the Democratic Party, was nominated as Polk's running mate. Henry Clay famously jeered, "Who is James K. Polk?" Other Whigs claimed that such action as Polk suggested with Texas and Oregon would bring a war on two fronts with both Britain and Mexico. However, the idea of expansion was popular with common voters. Though he lost Tennessee itself by less than 300 votes, Polk was elected with 170 of the 275 electors and 52% of the popular vote. James K. Polk was inaugurated on Thursday, March 4th, 1845. His inaugural address, far from the soaring rhetoric one might expect today. He spoke of how honored he was to be elected to such high office at a relatively young age, discussed preventing the spread of the federal government, and spent several minutes discussing the Texas question. His conclusion was humble. "I enter upon the discharge of the high duties which have been assigned to me by the people, again humbly supplicating that divine being who has watched over and protected our beloved country from its infancy to the present hour, to continue his gracious benedictions upon us, that we may continue to be a prosperous and happy people." Polk's campaign promises would have been entirely out of place in today's political landscape. His first was to only seek one term. The second, as we've already discussed, dealt with the most important issue of 1844, expansion and the annexation of Texas. An anecdote of Polk's presidential goals comes from his Secretary of the Navy, George Bancroft. As the story goes, around the time of his inauguration, Polk raised his hand high in the air, and then bringing it down with the force on his thigh, he predicts that the four great measures of his administration would be as follows: end the dispute with Great Britain over the Oregon Territory, reduce tariffs, establish an independent treasury, acquire California from Mexico. There were, however, some inconsistencies in Bancroft's story. The time seems to change from before and after the inauguration, and the story wasn't brought to the public knowledge until long after Polk's own death. Some historians dispute it as political legend.